So I'm also affiliated with Carnegie Mellon University, where I direct the Foundations of Cooperative AI Lab, in which we think about highly advanced agentic systems, and in particular how they might interact with each other and how that might go badly, for example, as they all pursue different objectives and maybe get into tragedy of the commons kind of dynamics. So there's far too much to talk about. To select something to talk about specifically now, I wanted to focus a little bit about language models because presumably we should talk a little bit about language models. And I would start with this little anecdote, which is now even from 2 years ago, where ChatGPT at some point started allowing the generation of images inside the interface of ChatGPT by passing prompts to DALL-E. And when this first came out, I was sitting around with some members of my group, and I asked it, well, can you draw the scene that we're currently in with 5 people sitting in a room discussing. Now we think a lot about game theory, and so I said, well, this was actually what was happening in the lab at the time. So one person is presenting about game theory, and it came up with these 4 images. There are, of course, many problems with the images, including, the number 5. It's generally more than 5 people, as you can see. The game theory images on the slide look interesting, but I can tell you that's not game theory. The thing I want to draw attention to is the diversity of the speakers. Yes, you have a remarkably diverse set of speakers, and that turned out to be no accident. Um, that was actually encoded in the prompts that the language model then passed on to the text-to-image model. You can actually ask it for the prompts, but in this case, I didn't, but actually in the file names, you could see what the prompts were. And the interesting thing was that in each of the prompts for each of the images, there were actually explicit instructions about the speaker and the gender and the descent of the speaker. And so you can see here fragments of the file name that I took that have this prompt. And the interesting thing is that I myself didn't say anything about diversity. And right, this was my full prompt here at the top. Um, so how did this happen? I presented this at some point at a workshop, and one of my colleagues from CMU, Derek Levin, he said, "Oh, Vince, I know exactly why that happened, because there is a hidden prompt." And Derek Goodman had managed earlier to extract this prompt. So this is the prompt that was governing how the language model created its own prompts for the text-to-image model. Derek had also saved this prompt, and so it's a very long prompt. Here I'm only showing part of it, and this is the part 8, that is about diversity in the images. And you can see very explicitly it says, you should include descent and gender for each person. Uh, there's lots of interesting things about this prompt. I'm happy to share the slides later. But for example, it says all possible descents should have equal probability. I don't even know exactly what that means, but that's what was in there. And so this clearly led to the behavior that we just saw. When Derek pointed this out to me, I said, oh, I have to try this too. And so I also eventually managed to extract the prompt, which takes a little bit of work. But by this point, it was a full month later, and things had changed. And so by January 2024, when I extracted the prompt, things had changed a lot. A lot of it was more about copyright and depicting real people. So they were starting to worry about legal issues. And in particular, the prompt part about diversity was gone. And so I tried to generate images again. I asked for a bunch of scientists hanging out and a bunch of basketball players hanging out, and you get this. So we see all the scientists are white. Well, there's an extra leg here. Maybe that one is not white. I'm not sure. And then we see the basketball players over here as well. So you can see these prompts, of course, have an impact on the images that are generated. And the thing I want to point attention to is, well, first of all, it's amazing that this works at all, right? I just want to, stop and reflect on this for, that 5 years ago, I would have never thought that the way we would be steering these kind of systems is just by a natural language saying something about the kind of images that we would want. At the same time, there's also the question of how do we come up with that prompt, right? And presumably, I don't know the process that went into generating these prompts, but I imagine it was a pretty ad hoc process within OpenAI. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. Incidentally, this particular episode and these prompts, we wrote a little blog post with the Institute for Ethics in AI about that is still up that you can find. Language models are interesting. I have a little hobby of getting strange behavior out of and ideally funny behavior out of the different language models. AI Overview is a prime candidate for that because it's not a very highly powered model. I like this one where it concludes that if you can follow an audiobook at 2 times speed, that must mean that you can follow two audiobooks simultaneously at 1 time speed, one in each ear. Uh, so we can have a lot of fun with these types of things. Now, sometimes when I post these examples, people have the mistaken impression that, oh, I'm not impressed by language models and I think it's all smoke and mirrors. That's actually not true. In some sense, I feel like, this is our unique chance that these models are at this stage where you can get this kind of funny behavior out of them. But it does, of course, say something about that they're taking a different path to any kind of general intelligence than we are, and that shows up in the behavior. It also illustrates that, well, for now, this is just funny, right? And no harm is done, presumably, by me getting this silly example that, isn't going to convince me to try to listen to two audiobooks at once. Um, the question, of course, is that as we move to more agentic systems and agentic deployments of systems based on language models, it really changes the impact of these kinds of systems. Right. And this is not the thing that I think we have aligned them very well for. And so I'm very curious to think about how we should be aligning with actions in mind. Um, we have actually worked on a much narrower domain, which is the domain of organ allocation, where AI is already involved as well. And there we have been doing somewhat similar things to the kinds of processes that we also see in RLHF, if you know about that, for language models, where we just ask human subjects for feedback. For example, who between two patients ought to be prioritized, if either one at all. This is a long-term project that we've had, and in some ways it's interesting because, or it's easier to think about because you can very clearly see what the consequences of this feedback and putting it back into the objective of a system will be on the overall system. And sometimes those consequences on the overall system aren't exactly what you would expect. Uh, so I think there's a big question of how do we do this now for agentic systems that are based on language models and similar techniques. And then finally, I also want to talk about again who should be doing this alignment, who should be creating these prompts or giving this kind of feedback in terms of comparison. So we have an agenda of using social choice theory. Social choice theory is about how do we collectively reach a decision, a judgment, and in this case, a system. I think this is an exciting area to work in that we need more work on, and we're organizing a workshop at the ICI conference in Paris on social choice for AI ethics and safety, and I hope maybe to see some of you there as well. I'll close by saying that, well, of course, there's so many worries that we may have about AI and its deployment in many different domains. Can't talk about all of it here. We try to cover this quite a bit in our book, Moral AI, that came out last year. Also, I already feel that this book is out of date. I'm terrible at selling the book in this way. But I think things are changing, especially in terms of having these relatively general purpose models behind things. And I think that changes also how we have to think about the different kinds of domains, that we can't think of all of them as completely separate anymore. While at the same time, of course, in the different domains, there are different impacts. And to some extent, we do still need to think about them separately. So let me close there and I look forward to the discussion.